On Tulane Avenue in New Orleans, there is a building that time forgot to demolish. 20 stories of Alabama limestone rise above the street, Art Deco details still visible on the facade, the bones of something that was once magnificent still intact. But the windows are hollow, the halls are silent, and the beds are empty. They have been for nearly 2 decades now. This is Charity Hospital, and its story does not end the way you might expect. It was not destroyed by fire, not swallowed by the earth, not condemned by age or even rendered obsolete by time. For nearly 300 years, this institution survived everything the city of New Orleans could throw at it: hurricanes, epidemics, political warfare, and poverty, on a scale that would have broken lesser places. It was the second oldest public hospital in the United States. It was the last refuge of the city's poorest residents, the place you went when you had nowhere else to go, the place that turned no one away. And then a storm came. Though this did not destroy it, the building survived, the walls held. Independent engineers walked the floors and declared it sound. What came after the storm? The decisions made in boardrooms and governors' offices while the city was still underwater. That is what ended Charity Hospital. This is the story of an institution that outlasted empires, outlasted disease, outlasted corruption, and outlasted disaster, only to be quietly abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect it. Chapter 1. A city built on sickness and need. To understand Charity Hospital, you first have to understand the city that made it necessary. New Orleans in the early 18th century was not the romantic gaslit city of legend. It was a fever swamp. A colonial outpost carved out of a bend in the Mississippi River by French settlers who had vastly underestimated what they were walking into. The soil was soft and waterlogged. The heat was merciless. And the diseases, yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, smallpox, moved through the population with a speed and brutality that no law, no prayer, and no medicine of the era could reliably stop. The city had been founded by France in 1718. Within a few years, it was already fighting for its life. Safe drinking water was nearly impossible to come by. The climate bred infection the way the swamps bred mosquitoes, endlessly, invisibly, without mercy. French colonial officials paid close attention to matters of health, not out of compassion, but out of necessity. A dead colony produced nothing. By 1723, the Superior Council had decreed that only medical practitioners examined and approved by the colony's chief surgeons could practice medicine, on penalty of death. The Ursuline nuns, arriving in 1726, took charge of what passed for a royal hospital, doing what they could with what little they had. But that hospital, the Royal Hospital, was never meant for everyone. It was expensive to operate, and the colonial government made its priorities clear. Admission was reserved for French military personnel and those employed in the king's direct service. The rest of the population, the dock workers, the sailors, the servants, the enslaved, the immigrants, the simply unlucky, were left entirely to fend for themselves. Some found their way to the Capuchin Fathers, a Catholic religious order that provided what care it could, but organized, reliable medical care for the poor of New Orleans did not exist. For the city's most vulnerable residents, falling sick was often a death sentence delivered without appeal. It was into this world that a man named Jean-Louis arrived and chose to do something about it. We know relatively little about Jean-Louis. He was French. He was a sailor and a shipbuilder who lived in New Orleans during the French colonial period, a man of modest means. Not wealthy by the standards of the colony, not powerful, not politically connected. What he was, it seems, was paying attention. On the 16th of November, 1735, Jean-Louis appeared before a notary and dictated his will. The document is remarkable in its simplicity and its ambition. After directing that his debts be paid and his final wishes honored, he gave everything that remained to fund, in his words, a hospital for the sick of New Orleans. No restrictions, no exclusions, for the sick, all of them. Jean-Louis died the following year. He never saw what his bequest would become. On the 10th of May, 1736, the executor of his estate purchased a house at the corner of what is now Chartres and Bienville streets in the French Quarter. The purchase price was 1,250 livres. That house became the first charity hospital, l'Hôpital des Pauvres de la Charité, the hospital for the poor of charity. The name said everything. This was not a hospital for the fortunate. It was not a hospital for the powerful. It was a hospital for those who had nothing, funded by a man who had very little, built on the belief that poverty was not a disqualification for care. That belief, radical then, contested still, would define this institution for the next 269 years. Chapter 2: Fire, Storm, and Survival. From the very beginning, this institution refused to stay down. The first charity hospital had barely opened before it was already too small. The house on Chartres and Bienville streets, purchased with Jean-Louis' bequest in 1736, filled with patients almost immediately. Within a single month of opening, the executor of Louis's estate was back before a notary, contracting the construction of an additional building on the same site, 45 feet long, 25 feet wide, to be built as soon as possible. The city's need was already outrunning its capacity to respond, and the hospital had existed for 30 days. By 1743, the hospital had outgrown its French Quarter location entirely and moved to a larger building at the edge of the colony on Basin Street. For a time, it served the growing population of New Orleans as the city expanded and the demand for care deepened. Then the storms came. New Orleans has always lived in negotiation with the sky. In 1779, back-to-back hurricanes tore through the city with devastating force. The hospital on Basin Street, already weathered and strained, did not survive intact. When the winds finally stilled and the water receded, almost nothing remained: a kitchen, a storehouse, 6 beds. By 1779, New Orleans was no longer French. The city had passed into Spanish hands in 1763, and with that transfer came a new administration with different priorities. The Spanish colonial government showed little urgency about rebuilding what the hurricanes had destroyed. The Cabildo, which was the governing body of the colony, debated and delayed while the sick had nowhere to go. Into that vacuum stepped a man named Don Andrés Almonaster y Roxas. Almonaster was Spanish by birth, a nobleman who had come to New Orleans shortly after Spain assumed control of Louisiana. He had been appointed royal notary by King Charles III himself, and in that role, handling every significant property transfer and legal transaction in the colony, he had become extraordinarily wealthy. He was one of the most powerful private citizens in New Orleans, a man who understood better than most what the city owed its people. When the Cabildo failed to act, Almonaster acted alone. He offered 114,000 pesos, his own money from his own fortune, to rebuild the hospital entirely. The offer was met with skepticism and bureaucratic resistance from the colonial government, which was not accustomed to private citizens stepping in to do what it had neglected. Almonaster pushed through the opposition. He not only funded the construction, but drafted a detailed governing constitution for the new facility, modeled on the rules of Spanish royal hospitals. The document was clear on who the hospital existed to serve. Only the poor in real distress, it stated, shall be admitted. On the 1st of October, 1785, the San Carlos Hospital opened, named in honor of King Charles III of Spain. It was the third home of what Jean-Louis had set in motion half a century earlier, and it stood for 24 years. Then, on the 22nd of September, 1809, fire consumed it. 3 patients died in the flames. The rest were evacuated to the Cabildo, then moved to a residence in the Faubourg Marigny, then to a dilapidated plantation, while the city scrambled to find a permanent solution. The state formally assumed responsibility for the hospital in 1813. A 4th building rose on Canal Street, where the Roosevelt Hotel stands today, and opened in 1815. It was described as vast and commodious, capable of caring for 120 patients. Critics described it differently. Many complained that the hospital served no purpose other than to confine the wretched and compel them to die somewhere inconvenient. Too few attendants, too little equipment, a building that fell short of the need it was built to meet from the moment it opened its doors. By 1832, a 5th hospital had risen on what is now Tulane Avenue, larger, more permanent, more capable. 2 years later, in 1834, the Daughters of Charity, a Catholic religious order, assumed management of the institution. They would run it for nearly a century, bringing to its halls a discipline and a devotion that no government administrator had quite managed to provide. 5 buildings in under a century, destroyed by hurricanes, burned to the ground, condemned by neglect. patched together from kitchens and plantation houses and borrowed rooms, while the city argued about what it owed its poor. And yet, the hospital endured. Not because the buildings were strong, most of them weren't, but because the idea at the center of it was. Jean-Louis had planted something in 1736 that proved more durable than limestone, more resistant than fire, more stubborn than any storm. Every time the institution fell, someone rebuilt it. Chapter 3: Politics, Power, and the Art Deco Giant. By the early 20th century, the fifth charity hospital was teetering on its feet. A century of service had been pressed into walls that were never meant to last that long, and the city around them had outgrown the building in every measurable way. The population of New Orleans had exploded in the decades since the fifth hospital was built, growing 30-fold while the hospital's bed capacity barely doubled. The numbers told a story that was almost impossible to comprehend. Charity was serving 2,780 patients every single day with only 1,814 beds to put them in. The math did not work, and the patients paid the price. Wards were so overcrowded that 2 patients were routinely placed in a single bed. The hallways filled, the waiting rooms filled, the floors filled. Doctors and nurses worked in conditions that would have strained a facility half as burdened. The building itself, cracked, aging, held together by repairs layered on top of repairs, groaned under the weight of what was being asked of it. Efforts to plan a replacement hospital began in earnest in 1923. They were almost immediately consumed by Louisiana politics. The name that defined Louisiana politics in that era was Huey Long. Long was the governor of Louisiana from 1928 and later a United States senator, a figure of volcanic ambition and genuine political cunning who had built a near-absolute grip on the machinery of the state. He was a complicated man by any measure, a champion of the poor who was also a ruthless authoritarian, a builder of roads and hospitals and universities who demanded personal loyalty as the price of every public good he delivered. A new charity hospital, the largest public institution in the state, was precisely the kind of monument Long wanted attached to his legacy. He wanted control of it, and when he wanted something in Louisiana, very little stood in his way. The path to building the hospital ran through the Federal Public Works Administration, the PWA, one of the great engines of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, which funded large-scale public construction projects across the country. But the PWA had conditions. State organizations applying for federal funds were required to cover 70% of the building's costs themselves. For Louisiana, that meant finding millions of dollars the state did not readily have. Charity's Board of Administrators proposed a solution: include a number of paying beds in the new hospital, a small for-profit element that would generate revenue to cover the local match. The proposal detonated immediately. The New Orleans medical community erupted in opposition. Local physicians and hospital administrators objected on moral grounds. Charity's sacred tradition of serving the indigent, they argued, should not be compromised by the introduction of commerce. Others were less idealistic and more direct. Paying beds at Charity would mean competition for the city's private hospitals, and they wanted no part of it. Huey Long, characteristically, had his own solution. He proposed a new state corporation tax, the proceeds of which would cover Louisiana's share of the construction costs. It was a bold move, and it was precisely the kind of naked power play that made the federal government increasingly uneasy about Long's intentions. The PWA, growing wary of Long's desire for total control over Louisiana's public works, quietly stalled. Not just Charity Hospital, every Louisiana building project funded by the PWA ground to a halt, while Washington watched and waited. The stalemate held for years. Then, on the 8th of September, 1935, Huey Long was shot in the corridors of the Louisiana State Capitol building he had built. He died 2 days later. Whatever one thought of the man, and opinions in Louisiana ranged from messianic devotion to absolute hatred. His death broke the political deadlock that had paralyzed the hospital project for years. Within months, Charity's proposal was reactivated. The PWA approved the project and awarded the construction contract to the architectural firm of Weiss, Dreyfus, and Seifert, the same firm that had designed the Louisiana State Capitol itself. Construction began in 1936, and almost immediately the earth pushed back. New Orleans sits on some of the most unpredictable soil in North America, a delta city built on accumulated river sediment, perpetually negotiating with the ground beneath it. Timber pilings were driven 25 feet deep into that soil to anchor the new hospital. The building began to rise, and then it began to sink. 9 inches of subsidence was recorded before engineers from Harvard and Yale universities were called in to assess the situation. They walked the structure, conducted their tests, studied the numbers, and delivered their verdict. The building was sound. It would need some additional bracing, but it would hold. They were right. The structure continued to settle, slowly, steadily, until it had sunk a full 18 inches into the Louisiana earth. 3.5 years after construction began, the building finally stilled. What had emerged from that long, contentious, politically tortured process was extraordinary. 20 stories of Alabama limestone rose above Tulane Avenue, a soaring Art Deco tower that announced itself as something permanent, something serious, something built to last. 2,680 beds made it the second largest hospital in the United States at the time of its completion. It was, by any measure, a monument. But monuments carry the marks of the hands that build them. The separate wings of the new charity hospital were designed to house black patients and white patients in strictly segregated facilities. Louisiana's segregation laws literally pressed into the architecture, written in limestone and steel. The building that was meant to serve everyone equally was shaped from its very foundation by the inequalities of the world around it. And then there was the duck. Above the main entrance, sculptor Enrique Alferez had designed an ornamental aluminum grille titled Louisiana at Work and Play, a sweeping decorative piece depicting the life of the state. It was widely admired. What was less widely noticed at first was a small image tucked into the composition, a flying duck. It was not decorative, it was a joke, and a pointed one. Under Huey Long and his successor Governor Richard Leachy, state employees had been subject to a system of mandatory salary deductions, forced contributions to political campaigns delivered through what was known, with grim Louisiana humor, as the deducts. When Long wanted money from state workers, word went out that the deducts were flying. Alferez, working on a federally funded building, embedded a flying duck into the artwork above the entrance, a coded mockery of the corruption woven into the project's origins. When Governor Leachy discovered it, he was not amused. He dispatched men with hacksaws to remove the offending bird. They arrived, they looked at the grill, and then a journalist quietly informed them that damaging a piece of federally funded public art might constitute a federal offense. The duck stayed. It is still there today, small, defiant, hidden in plain sight above the entrance of a building that no longer functions as a hospital, a sculptor's act of resistance outlasting the governor who tried to erase it, outlasting the political machinery that built and corrupted and complicated this place at every turn. Opened in 1939, Big Charity had finally risen. Ambition, corruption, engineering, and the weight of the city's poorest residents all pressed together into 20 stories of limestone on Tulane Avenue. It would stand for 66 years. Chapter 4: The Soul of the South. To walk into Charity Hospital was to step into a world unto itself, not just a hospital in the conventional sense, a place you visited, received treatment, and left. Charity was something larger and stranger and more total than that. It was a teaching institution that trained generations of physicians. It was a trauma center that handled the worst the city could produce on its worst nights. It was a research environment, a nursing school, a psychiatric facility, and a public health infrastructure rolled into a single 20-story building. And underneath all of it, animating all of it, it was the institution that existed so that the people who had nothing would still have somewhere to go. To understand what was lost when Charity closed, you have to understand what it actually was, not the symbol, the place. The roots of that place ran deeper than the 6th Hospital's limestone walls. From almost the moment the 5th Hospital opened its doors, Charity had been inseparable from the education of physicians in New Orleans. In 1834, a group of American physicians newly arrived in the city founded the Medical College of Louisiana on a straightforward and audacious arrangement. Faculty would provide free medical care to Charity's patients, and in exchange, the hospital would be open every day for the attendance of students. Charity became a classroom. Its patients, the poor, the sick, the desperate, became the living curriculum through which a generation of Southern physicians learned their craft. That tradition of faculty care would continue in practice well into the 1960s, a thread of obligation running across more than a century of American medicine. By the 1850s, Charity Hospital had grown into something almost incomprehensible in scale. By some accounts, it was the largest hospital in the world. By 1931, a second medical school had taken root on the Charity grounds. LSU's School of Medicine, its students and faculty sharing wards and operating rooms with Tulane's in a decades-long academic rivalry played out against a backdrop of poverty and need. To understand the full weight of what Charity was asked to carry across all those years, through the 19th century and into the 20th, it helps to go back to one particular summer that laid bare, with terrible clarity, what this institution actually faced. But no chapter in Charity's history captures that weight more starkly than the summer of 1858. Yellow fever had stalked New Orleans for most of the 19th century. The city's geography, its heat, standing water, dense population, and constant flow of ships from tropical ports made it one of the most dangerous places in the United States for the disease. Outbreaks came and went with terrible regularity. But 1858 was different in its scale, its speed, and its lethality. That year, 2,727 patients were admitted to Charity Hospital with yellow fever. Of those, 1,382 died, more than half. The wards filled beyond capacity. Nurses and doctors worked in conditions of sustained horror. Fever patients in every bed, in every corridor, on every available surface, knowing that the disease they were treating could just as easily take them. Total patient admissions that year reached 11,337. The building absorbed it all, or tried to. The dead were removed and replaced by the dying, and the work continued because there was no alternative. That extremity of demand never entirely left the institution. It became part of the texture of the place. So did its racial geography. The 6th hospital, opened in 1939, had been built with segregation written into its architecture. The two main wings of the building housed black patients and white patients in separate facilities, in compliance with Louisiana's segregation laws. As separate wards, entrances, everything. Except the poverty that brought people there in the first place, which did not observe racial boundaries. The wings were described as roughly equal in their facilities, but separate and equal are words that carry a particular history in the American South, and at Charity, as everywhere, the equality was more architectural than real. Integration came slowly and painfully across the middle decades of the 20th century, as it did everywhere in the South. The wards that had been divided by law were gradually, grudgingly merged. The building that had been designed to keep people apart was reshaped into something closer to what its founding mission had always implied. Through all of it, the staff of Charity maintained something that visitors and physicians who passed through the building consistently remarked upon: a commitment to the work that went beyond what any salary or career incentive could reasonably explain. Doctors who had trained at Charity and gone on to prestigious careers elsewhere remembered the place with a complicated reverence, for the conditions that had been genuinely difficult, and for the spirit that had somehow persisted inside them. By the late 20th century, Charity had earned recognition that matched its reputation. The hospital was designated a Level 1 trauma center, the highest classification in American emergency medicine, reserved for facilities with the beds, the equipment, the surgical specialists, and the round-the-clock capacity to handle any emergency that came through the doors. Charity ranked number 2 in the nation. Only Cook County Hospital in Chicago stood above it. Number 2 in the nation. In a building where the system strained and the resources fell short, and the gap between what the institution gave and what it received in return had been growing quietly for decades. That was the central contradiction of Charity Hospital, the thing that made it, depending on who you asked, either a triumph or an indictment. Magnificent and squalid at the same time, heroic in its purpose and neglected in its maintenance, indispensable to the city and perpetually starved of what it needed to function as it deserved. The city needed Charity more than it was ever willing to invest in it. That gap would only widen. Chapter 5: Decay, Neglect, and a City's Dependency. In 1970, the Louisiana Department of Health and Human Resources assumed administrative control of the hospital. Then, in 1997, ownership passed again, this time to the Louisiana State University system. Two major transfers in under 30 years, each carrying fresh instability, fresh rounds of deferred decisions, and fresh promises about what would be done to address the building's growing needs. Eventually had a way of never arriving. The physical reality of charity by the early 2000s was something that the hospital's reputation struggled to contain. A building now more than 6 decades old, operating in a climate that was merciless to aging infrastructure. The limestone facade still rose 20 stories above Tulane Avenue, still commanded attention, still looked like something permanent and serious from the outside. Inside, the story was different. Deferred maintenance had accumulated across decades. Systems that should have been replaced were patched. Equipment that had aged past its useful life was kept running through ingenuity and institutional habit. In a city where summer temperatures regularly pushed past 90 degrees with a humidity to match, the air conditioning worked intermittently at best. Staff and patients alike endured conditions that would have been unacceptable in any private facility, and were only tolerated at charity because there was no alternative, and because the people who worked there had long ago made their peace with the gap between what the place deserved and what it received. The neighborhood around the building had not fared well either. Tulane Avenue, once a central artery of the city's medical and civic life, had been worn down by decades of urban decay. The blocks surrounding the hospital carried the particular heaviness of American cities that had been left behind. And yet, the work continued. The staff continued to hold charity together through something that went beyond professional obligation, the same quality of commitment that exceeded what any reasonable person could expect as the building aged around the people who refused to let it fail. By 2005, the building was still standing. It was still saving lives. But the walls were tired, the systems were fragile, the resources were thin, and somewhere out in the Gulf of Mexico, the water was beginning to stir. Chapter 6: Hurricane Katrina and 5 Days in Hell. Dr. Ed Holton had thought about this moment for years. As Charity Hospital's chief of disaster preparedness, Holton had spent considerable time and energy building a planning model for the scenario he feared most. A slow-moving storm, powerful enough to overwhelm New Orleans' levee system, turning the city into a bowl of standing water with a hospital full of critically ill patients at its center. He had drilled for it. He had argued for funding for it. Not always successfully, because disaster preparedness competed with every other budget priority a hospital carried. And a catastrophe that might never come was a difficult thing to spend money on when patients needed care today. Holton had found a way to access federal terrorism preparedness funds, arguing persuasively that New Orleans levees were as vulnerable to deliberate attack as to nature. The funding came through, and with it, Holton had acquired portable generators, a stockpile of food, and a ham radio system capable of maintaining communications when every landline in the city went dark. It was not everything Holton would have wanted, but it was more than almost any other hospital in the city had. The generators arrived at Charity Hospital 1 week before Hurricane Katrina. On the 29th of August, 2005, Katrina made landfall along the Gulf Coast. The storm was among the most powerful Atlantic hurricanes ever recorded, and it struck with the particular brutality of a system that had been feeding on warm water for days. New Orleans braced, the winds and the rain came, and then, the morning after landfall, the levees began to fail. Water poured into the city. It filled the streets. It climbed the walls of houses and crept under doors. The emergency department of Charity Hospital began to flood. Dozens of patients were moved to the second-floor auditorium, lifted out of the rising water by staff who were already running on adrenaline. Then, the main generator failed. 400 patients, 1,200 staff members, plunged together into darkness. In the hours and days that followed, Charity Hospital became something that existed at the very edge of what human beings can endure and still function. The temperature inside the building climbed past 100 degrees. The air was dense and close and increasingly difficult to breathe. Essential supplies began to dwindle. Conditions deteriorated in ways that tested every person inside those walls. And still, the work continued. Nurses hand-pumped ventilators to keep patients breathing, performing by hand what the machines had done automatically until the power died. Doctors hauled fuel up dimly lit stairwells. Some physicians, facing the chaos beyond the hospital walls, began carrying sidearms. The world outside charity had become something that required a different kind of preparation than medicine. From a window somewhere in the upper floors, someone fashioned a banner from bed sheets and hung it where it might be seen from the air. The message was simple and unambiguous. Get us the hell out of here. Help was coming, but it was not coming quickly. The city outside was overwhelmed in ways that made any coordinated response nearly impossible, and the resources available were stretched far beyond capacity. And then came the sniper reports. Reports, never fully verified, described a gunman on a rooftop near the hospital, allegedly firing toward the building and toward the rescue helicopters attempting to land. Whatever the full truth of those events, what was not in dispute was the effect. The helicopter evacuation of Charity Hospital was halted for more than half a day. Patients who had already endured days of darkness and heat and fear waited longer still, while the staff around them worked to keep them alive with dwindling resources and sheer determination. The evacuation, when it finally moved forward fully, was conducted by military helicopters and airboats that ferried patients through the flooded streets and lifted them to safety. It was not a single dramatic rescue, but a grinding, exhausting, days-long operation, carried out by people who had already been pushed past every reasonable limit. The last patients left Charity Hospital 5 days after the storm made landfall. And when the final count was taken, something remarkable emerged from the wreckage of those 5 days. Despite the darkness, the heat, the failed generators, and the rising water, and the dwindling supplies, and the chaos of a city coming apart around them, and despite everything that had been asked of 400 patients and 1,200 staff members in conditions that should not have been survivable, not one patient was lost to the floodwaters. That outcome stands as one of the most extraordinary acts of collective human endurance in the history of American medicine. It stands as a testament to Ed Holton's years of preparation. The generators, the radio system, the drills, the planning that everyone around him had treated as a back-burner issue until it became the only issue that mattered. And it stands as a testament to every doctor, every nurse, every orderly, every staff member who spent 5 days in that building, choosing again and again, in the dark and the heat and the fear, to keep doing the work. The water receded. The helicopters stopped coming. The building stood empty for the first time in decades, battered, exhausted, but standing. The 20 stories that had risen from the New Orleans soil in 1939, that had been built through political warfare and assassination and corruption and compromise, they had held. Charity Hospital had survived Hurricane Katrina. Let that land for a moment, because what comes next is not a story about what the storm destroyed. It is a story about what came after, about the meetings that were held and the decisions that were made and the future that was chosen while the city was still underwater and the people who depended on this building had nowhere else to go. The storm did not close Charity Hospital. What happened next did. Chapter 7. The decision. Why Charity never reopened. When the floodwaters receded, the people who loved Charity Hospital got to work. Medical staff returned to the building. Volunteers came with mops and buckets and the kind of determined, sleeves-rolled-up energy that disasters sometimes produce in people who refuse to accept that something is over. They scrubbed the first 3 floors, assessed the damage, looked at what the storm had left behind, and concluded, with the particular clarity of people who had spent their careers in this building, that it could be saved, that it should be saved, that the founding purpose of this institution was not finished, and neither was the building that housed it. They were not alone in that assessment. Independent structural analyses declared the building sound, and the Foundation for Historical Louisiana went further, commissioning the internationally renowned architectural firm R.M.J.M. Hillier to evaluate the entire structure. Their conclusion was direct. The Art Deco building was architecturally exceptional, ahead of its time in its original design, and rehabilitation into a modern facility would be the fastest and most cost-effective path to returning quality healthcare to New Orleans. The case for reopening Charity was, by any technical measure, compelling. 3 weeks after Hurricane Katrina made landfall, Governor Kathleen Blanco announced that Charity Hospital would not reopen. The Louisiana State University system, which owned the building, followed with its own statement. There were no plans to reopen the hospital at its original location. A new facility would be built instead. The old building on Tulane Avenue was to be set aside in favor of a new construction project. That project would become University Medical Center New Orleans. It would cost $1.1 billion. It would open in August of 2015, a full decade after Katrina. A decade during which the city's most vulnerable residents, the people Charity had existed to, serve, would need to find care somewhere else. The decision landed on the community like a second disaster. Families were displaced from low-income neighborhoods to clear land for the new medical campus. People who had lived in those blocks for generations were displaced again, this time by the infrastructure meant to serve them. The new hospital that rose in their place was, critics noted, structured and priced in ways that made it significantly less accessible to the indigent population that Charity had always served without question and without cost. The fight to save the building did not end quietly. Community activists organized, preservationists made their case. Physicians who had trained at Charity stood before cameras and in public meetings and argued that what was happening was a betrayal of the institution, of its patients, of the promise embedded in its founding. Spike Lee's documentary, released in 2010, gave many of those voices a national platform, weaving their testimonials into a portrait of a city that had survived a catastrophe only to be failed by the decisions that followed it. It was not enough. And in the years between Katrina and the opening of University Medical Center, the human cost accumulated in ways that were real and measurable and largely invisible to anyone not living through them. The mental health infrastructure of New Orleans, which had depended heavily on charity services, effectively collapsed. The Spirit of Charity, a temporary clinic established first at the convention center and later relocated near the Superdome, did what it could. University Hospital reopened with a fraction of Charity's capacity. Straining under a load it was never designed to carry alone. Doctors, nurses, and community health workers described a city in crisis. Not the acute crisis of the storm itself, but the slower, quieter crisis of a population without adequate care, accumulating in emergency rooms and the spaces between institutions that were trying their best and falling short. The building stayed closed. The new hospital was built. The old one was left to stand empty on Tulane Avenue, architecturally exceptional, and entirely absolutely silent. There is a particular kind of grief that attaches to things that didn't have to happen. Tragedies of circumstance carry their own weight, but they carry also a kind of fatalism. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. And what can any of us do in the face of forces that large? But tragedies of decision are different. Chapter 8: Abandonment and Afterlife. For nearly 2 decades, it just stood there. 20 stories of Alabama limestone on Tulane Avenue, windows dark, doors sealed. The Art Deco details on the facade slowly weathering into something that looked less like architecture and more like memory. The neighborhood moved around it, traffic passed below it. The city rebuilt itself, piece by piece. In the years after Katrina, photographers and adventurers who moved through the darkened corridors with flashlights and cameras, recording what time and abandonment were doing to the building from the inside. What they found was not ruins exactly. It was something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. A wheelchair left in a corridor where someone last sat in 2005. Patient intake forms still visible through cracked glass. The physical residue of a place that had been functioning one day and simply stopped. Hallways that had once moved with the controlled urgency of a level 1 trauma center, now thick with dust and silence. The bones of the institution still present, still legible, but emptied of everything that had made them matter. People who spent time in the building began reporting something else as well. Historians, researchers, and preservationists came away with stories, sounds without sources, presences in empty rooms. The accumulated weight of a building that had witnessed more human suffering and human endurance than almost any structure in the American South. Whether one believes in such things or not, the reputation became part of the building's identity in its abandoned years. When the production designer for the 2023 film Renfield was searching for a location to serve as Dracula's lair, He chose Charity Hospital. He noted afterward that every historian he had consulted during his research had stories about the building being haunted. The dilapidated basement of the old hospital became the modern-day home of Dracula. It was, the production team felt, a natural fit. Charity had drawn cameras before during its operating years and after its closure. Spike Lee's 2010 documentary, If God is Willing and A Creek Don't Rise, devoted a substantial segment to the fight over the building's future, and the 2013 film Hours used the hospital as its backdrop for a story of survival set during the storm itself. Slowly in recent years, the conversation around the building has shifted. In 2019, LSU approved a redevelopment plan for the property. Then the global COVID-19 pandemic arrived and stalled everything, as it stalled so much else. In 2021, Tulane University signed a long-term lease on the Charity Hospital property. Plans were announced for student housing, research laboratories, and Tulane's School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. The institution that had once trained physicians in Charity's wards would now make the building its own in a different form. In February of 2025, Tulane reaffirmed its commitment to the project. A projected reopening date of 2027 was announced. The building will live again. That much finally seems certain. But it will not be a hospital. It will not turn no one away. It will not be the place you go when you have nowhere else to go. The limestone tower that Jean-Louis' bequest made possible will become apartments and research labs and a school of public health that studies, among other things, the conditions that make places like Charity necessary in the first place. Chapter 9. What was left behind. The building is still there, 20 stories of Alabama limestone on Tulane Avenue. The windows are still hollow, the halls are still silent, but the walls are standing, as they have been standing in one form or another, since a French sailor named Jean-Louis decided that the poor of New Orleans deserved somewhere to go. He had nothing really, a modest estate, a notarized will. A belief, stated simply and without grandeur, that the sick should be cared for, regardless of what they could offer in return. He died in 1736 and never saw a single patient walk through the door he had paid to open. But what he set in motion outlasted him by nearly 3 centuries. It outlasted 5 buildings destroyed by fire and storm and neglect. It outlasted 2 colonial rulers and the transfer of a city between empires. It outlasted yellow fever epidemics that killed more than half the patients in its wards. Even segregation written into its architecture, political warfare that held its construction hostage, and a hurricane that flooded its floors and plunged its patients into darkness. The mission was more durable than any of it. What Hurricane Katrina destroyed in New Orleans was vast and terrible and real. Neighborhoods, livelihoods, lives. The social fabric of communities that had taken generations to build. No honest accounting of that storm minimizes what it took. But Charity Hospital was not among the things the storm destroyed. The building stood. What was lost at Charity Hospital was not lost to the storm. It was lost to the decisions made after the storm had passed. It was folded away, set aside, replaced with something newer and more expensive and less accessible to the people it was always supposed to serve. And that distinction matters. It matters because disasters do not make decisions. People do. Institutions do. Governments do. And the decisions made in the aftermath of catastrophe reveal, with a clarity that ordinary times often obscure, what a society actually values. Not what it says it values, but what it chooses when the choice is real and the cost is visible, and the most vulnerable people are watching and waiting to see what comes next.